Welcome to the Emergent Human, where we explore optimizing health, embodied spirituality, and post-conventional living. I'm Michael Ostrolenk, a somatic educator, executive coach, and transpersonal guide, and I'm your host. Just a brief update. I want to do a shout out to my friend Jan Winhall. She has a new book available for pre-order entitled Treating Trauma and Addiction with Felt Sense Polyvagal Model, a Bottom-Up Approach. I will include a link in the show notes. Today's show is brought to you by Casper Scafidi, an amazing body worker in the Northern Virginia area who has integrated different somatic approaches into his work, including Rolfing. You can learn more about Casper's work at www.casperscafidi, that's COSPERSCAFIDI.com. And he is an amazing body worker. He happens to be my own. And I'm very excited to have our guest today, Antero Alli. He is the author of two books advancing Timothy Leary's 8-circuit brain model, called Angel Tech, published in 1985, and the 8-circuit brain, Navigational Strategies for the Energetic Body, published in 2009. His 8-circuit work has been endorsed by Timothy Leary and Robert Anton Wilson. Over the past 15 years, Antero has taught an annual interactive online course exploring the practical applications of the 8-circuit model. He resides in Portland, Oregon, with his wife, Sylvie Alli, who's also a singer. How are you doing today?
Pretty good. How are you doing?
Good. Very excited to have this conversation with you, and I'm very much appreciative of you willing to come on the podcast. As we spoke a little bit offline, I was the 8-circuit model was brought to my attention in the late 90s when I was doing all my graduate work in transpersonal psychology. So I had the opportunity to read Leary's work, had the opportunity to read Robert Anton Wilson's work, and thanks to my friend Jamie Wheel, he brought the model back to my attention probably 3 or 4 months ago. And as a result of kind of digging back into it, I was thrilled to discover your work, which is just as old as, kind of Leary's and Robert Anton Wilson's. But like you've done an amazing job of kind of updating the model and then adding a lot of practices to it. But before we jump into the model per se and your work kind of promoting it and helping people better understand it, I'd love to hear more about your story, how you got into this space in general, and then how you discovered and started working through the 8-circuit model in particular.
Okay, I'm going to give you the kind of the short story. That's a long, twisted tale. So back in 1979, I was reading Bob Wilson's book, Cosmic Trigger. And this book is he calls it his neurological autobiography, and he wrote it a couple of years after a tragic occurrence in his life when his daughter was randomly murdered. And I was genuinely touched by how he described and lived through his responses to this tragedy that I think I don't know if it would be for a lesser person or a person of lesser imagination and will, would have completely, I think, destroyed that person for the rest of their life to have to live with the knowledge and memory of such a horrible event. But somehow he had this intelligence for, now what I'm going to say here, I'm hoping it's not going to sound too flippant, but it's the only way I can describe it, of converting the tragic into magic. And this was so compelling to me, even though I didn't understand it at the time. I had not really known anything really that I would call tragic. I was like maybe 25, 26 years old. But there was one section in Cosmic Trigger that he dedicated to the 8-circuit brain system that he borrowed from his friend Timothy Leary and somehow put it into the context of the story that he was writing about his life. Well, his life story is really amazing, but there was something about the 8-circuit model that immediately stood out to me as a significant contribution. And And I became kind of obsessed with it, but felt that there was something lacking in the application, because I wanted to experience firsthand, what these 8 circuits represented, because it is a symbolic system. It's not a biological system like the Hindu chakra system, for example. It is based in the biological endocrine system of the body, of the glandular system. The 8 circuit brain is a symbolic system. It's not biological. It represents 8 functions of intelligence, and also 8 states of consciousness, perhaps, that are attached to those. Anyway, my history up to that point had been primarily as a performer, director, and teacher of theater, especially physical theater. So I was already deeply immersed in somatic creative expression. And I started experimenting with coming up with exercises, theater games at first, that turned into rituals, that turned into meditations, to see if I could trigger the direct experience of the states of consciousness and the functions of intelligence that the 8 circuits represented. And I got a little bit of success in the beginning processes of that to encourage me to keep going. And then I finally wrote a kind of initial manuscript that took, maybe 3 years. And I presented it to Bob at the time. There's a whole section of the story I'm leaving out, is how I met Bob, which people can look into. My book, The 8 Circuit Brain, goes into that. And he agreed to read the manuscript, and he says, if I can get behind it, I'll write you a preface. And fortunately, he was able to get behind it. He wrote the preface, and that allowed me to step into the circle of publication, because he was already a well-known published author, and with his preface, it kind of sanctioned a direction in my life as a published author. And then about 25 years later, after much experimentation with the model, I realized that I had advanced it far beyond the first book, which was called Angel Tech. And I had to write, I felt compelled to write the advancement of that process in a new book, even though I didn't want to. Writing books, I've written like 8 or 9 books. I can't keep up with it. But writing books has been the most difficult thing I know how to do, and I never want to do it when the compulsion to write a book comes up. It's always, I'm kind of kicking, screaming, and crying going through it. But this book, I felt I needed to write not for me, but for a younger generation that was perhaps in need of discovering some kind of map or grid to start helping them make sense of the escalating uncertainties that we're all experiencing, even more amplified now during the COVID era. And it's these escalating uncertainties that, as a theater artist and also as a filmmaker now, that I've come to interpret as a creative state. So to me, a state of uncertainty is synonymous with a creative state. And so my bias in writing, the 8 circuit brain, and pretty much everything I do is really, based in the experience of uncertainty as a creative state.
If you don't mind, I'd love to go back to you in your early to mid 20s, and tell me about who you were showing up that you thought you could write a book and get Robert Anton Wilson to support it. Because I think that's, there's a lot of confidence that you must have had, at least seemingly, to be able to do so, which is awesome. And it's exemplar for other people.
I think as a young man, I had a kind of bogus confidence that was supported by an experience that I had throughout my 20s of making an art out of poverty. I never had a 9-to-5 job because I was obsessed with writing works for theater that I would then audition actors for and end up producing and directing these experimental theater productions, which I did all throughout, my 20s. And that built its own kind of confidence, this capacity for just coming up with a dream and then finding a way to magnetize others to participate in the dream that then became their dream as well. And so I became this person building confidence for the realization of my dreams, which for me was just, it was never about, money or fame. It was about materializing visions that I had in the theatrical dimension on stage, where characters came to life that interacted. And I don't know, it's kind of a thrilling thing for me. So around the time I met Bob, I stopped writing plays and I started a punk rock band where I was writing, the music and I was performing guitar for. And so I got into the whole punk rock scene as just participating. That was in 1979, 1980. It was right around the time I met Bob. And so that had its own kind of confidence to it too, just to start a band and to start gigging in a band. So it was the kind of confidence that I think a lot of 20-somethings come up with, just, because they have passions that drive them that are alternative to the mainstream of, values of making a lot of money and, getting married and having kids or, whatever, that meant. And none of that was really, interesting to me at all.
Let me ask you about that, because one of the many things I think is really fascinating about you, and definitely let me encourage folks to read your book, The Eight Circuit Brain, Navigational Strategies for the Energetic Body, both for your story and for the more information about the model and practices, is that you seemingly have intentionally kept your ego in check and not sought fame and fortune, where a lot of people in the space of personal growth and development and new models and maps of reality and et cetera, they play the success game, as we conventionally know it here in the States. And so I'm wondering, like, what was about you, your upbringing, your way you thought about yourself, that you thought about the world, which allowed you to kind of keep that in check and not play that game?
I don't know, about keeping my ego in check. I've had quite a few reality checks to my ego along the way.
Okay, good to know.
But the process of making my dreams come true, meaning writing for theater and starting a band, that whole process in my 20s definitely developed a healthy and strong ego for me. However, the consequences of developing a strong ego, sometimes it crosses that border between a strong ego into a big ego. Mm-hmm. And to me, there's a major difference between a big ego and a strong ego. And I had to learn that difference. I had to learn flexibility, because I discovered that the big ego is basically having a big idea of myself. That's all it meant. And it took into my 30s to get more excited about how to get by without having much of any idea about myself, meaning I found it more interesting to think about other things and to focus on what I was seeing rather than focus on, who I thought I was.
Well, let me just point out how unique that really is, especially, and we'll get into it as people play around with higher circuits, the post-survival circuits, 5 through 8. It seems like a lot of people who start playing that space get messiah complexes of various sorts. And in reading your various works, that never really came across, like that you took yourself so seriously. You took the model and the practices very seriously to a certain extent, but also recognizing it's just a model. But it didn't seem like you ever really took yourself that seriously in this space, which, as I said, is very unique. So why don't we take this opportunity to kind of do a short dive into the different circuits, so people can kind of get an understanding of what we're talking about. We can walk through the first 4 survival circuits and then the 4 post-survival circuits, if that's okay with you.
Sure. I'll have only done this like the 87th time, but I'm going to see if I can mix it up a bit. So I think the way I'd like to just introduce the first 4 circuits is through maybe some kind of examples of how people might experience this firsthand. So the first circuit refers to our physical intelligence, which is our capacity pretty much to stay healthy and physically healthy specifically, and our it's a kind of almost like a street smart level of intelligence for surviving on the planet. Is your capacity for survival is pretty much measured through what I call first circuit experience. And second circuit, more complex because it refers to the emotional and territorial and status orientation of what it means to be a human animal. And I say human animal because animals in all across the spectrum of what it means to be an animal, there's a great focus in hierarchy and pecking order and territoriality. And so human animals also have territorial instincts. They have a strong sense of this is mine, that is yours. No, that's not yours. This is mine. Territorial disputes, border conflicts. These are all, in a sense, territorial concerns that relate to the second circuit. And so the second circuit experience is basically the extent that you have some sense of what you can actually call your own. And also some sense of, let's say, personal boundaries, so that you have a sense of, okay, where you leave off and someone else takes on, so that you have some respect for the personal territory of others. That becomes its own kind of emotional intelligence to be able to discern, the difference between your turf and someone else's turf. And if you have a problem or a confusion of that, you get into turf wars, you get into arguments and, power struggles and power plays. And that also involves second circuit experiences, is where we're at with power and the kind of power we're into. And power here is not, a good or bad thing. It's more about, how, you choose to participate as an influence, how you choose to influence others. It's in a sense, a definition of your own politics, your own personal politics. Circuit 3 refers to intellectual and symbolic intelligence. And we're really talking about how you personally make sense of things, how you interpret your experiences, how you develop maps in your head that hopefully points you to the territory of what the maps are symbolizing. And this is part of the challenge or the conundrum of the third circuit areas, that it's very easy sometimes for especially in these days, of identity politics and so forth, to confuse the map in your head for the territory, to confuse the map in your head, meaning your interpretations, your beliefs, for absolute reality. And you get into all kinds of human stupidity, as a result of that, or, the mistake of confusing any one part for the whole. So let's say you go to a restaurant and there's, like 20 items on the menu, and you choose one item and you decide, oh, I don't like this item. The whole restaurant sucks. I'm never going back there again. So that would be, an example of confusing, one part for the whole thing. And that becomes its own kind of third circuit, conundrum. Fourth circuit is called the social, moral, sexual circuit. The most complex circuit of all, because it, in a sense, incorporates the previous three circuits into a highly complex arrangement of experiences that run the spectrum from, how you, make friends, meaning your kind of social or friendship criteria, what determines friendship. It also determines, your particular morality or ethics, how you come to determine whether something's good or bad or good or evil. And also your sexual identity, not necessarily the sexual experience, the orientation. Sexual orientation is much more complex because it involves the previous three circuits as well. But how you identify in society, whether, I'm bisexual or heterosexual or omnisexual or pans, so that becomes its own kind of social identity. And so social politics, the kind of group that you identify with, the kind of religion that you identify with, all of these kinds of experiences are, can be included in Circuit 4. And what's interesting to me is that just the bottom four can give, being able to differentiate between the four. And in real life, it's much more messy. You can't really, the lines are much blurrier between the four, but it can give you some sense of differentiation. And if you can do that, it can become a little easier to discover which circuit you tend to be more fixated in, which circuit you tend to be more kind of treadmilling in or stuck in, or where you can't seem to escape territoriality issues, or you can't seem to get out of your head, or you can't seem to get beyond identifying with one particular group or another, and then you develop animosity towards opposing groups and so forth, and you have a fourth circuit treadmilling issue there.
Let me ask you, before you get into the post-survival circuits, could you map these onto developmental psychology? Like, for instance, biosurvival circuit is initiated at a certain stage of development for infant to childhood. Territorial emotionality, circuit 2 is triggered at a certain time, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I would say so. But there's also the cultural complexity, meaning, society at large carries its own standards and values and definitions for what it means to be a physical person, what it means to be emotional, or what it means to be intellectual, or what is the right way to be a social citizen, and so forth, that oftentimes will run in conflict and agitation with one's, let's say, more innate or true responses to those experiences.
Could you say a little bit more about that? With an example?
Yeah. The only thing I can do is kind of go by my own experiences.
Please
and
do.
You mentioned the word success earlier on. And success is what I would call more of a second circuit orientation, because it is really about your experience of winning, or what does it mean to win? What does it mean to lose? What does it mean to succeed? What does it mean to fail? So early on, I discovered, and this was probably through, I had an experience directing a 3-act poem play by E.E. Cummings in the mid-'70s called Him, H-I-M. And I often take on poets, different poets, for different projects that I do, because I tend to learn more from poets than even from philosophers or, other kinds of writers. But anyway, I learned through E.E. Cummings about the subjectivity of success, that actual success, true success, was actually subjective. And what that meant to me was that the notion of success was up for grabs, that I had the freedom to define success on my own terms. And once I defined those terms, it was basically up to me to live by those terms and become successful on my own terms. And that became much more exciting to me than, following the cookie cutter idea of success that is sanctioned by society at large.
It makes sense. All right. So what I'm hearing you say then is that each of the first four circuits, to a certain extent, match to developmental psychology. So they're initiated or triggered at certain stages of development from an infant to an adult. I would also imagine too that you can maybe speak shortly or briefly, excuse me, about how it also connects psychophysiologically, meaning that the parts of the brain, for instance, the biosurvival circuit would be certain aspects of the brain. The territorial emotional would be other aspects of the brain or the nervous system at large, because you also talk about, for instance, circuit two, the fight or flight reflex, which is
Yeah.
obviously into the nervous system.
So I don't know if I'd be the right person to talk science with you. I'm more of kind of artist poet kind of person. And so I leave the science to the scientists and the brain researchers. And even though this model is called the eighth circuit brain per se, I don't really view it so much as a scientific system, or I don't seek, let's say, scientific validity or approval or validation or legitimacy for it. And the reason being is that I've seen too much of the results, not just from my own life, but over the last 15 years, teaching it to others and interacting with hundreds of other individuals who've applied the system in various ways, and then reading about their results, reading about the changes in their life that have occurred as a result of just simply doing the exercises and gaining direct knowledge of these experiences, so that they're not just reading about it or talking about it, but they've actually started living it.
Got it. No, that makes sense. And what I think you've paved the way for, because you've kind of upgraded and expanded the original model from Timothy Leary, who I would love to hear the story you tell shortly about where he got it from, and that Robert Anton Wilson expanded his, and then you're expanding it further. That I would imagine that you're very open to others taking this model in their own kind of scientific or artistic endeavors to expand it even further. And I'm wondering, if I have to imagine this is a question for you, do you have students who have done that actually?
Oh yeah. No, I just say good luck. good luck. It's a highly ambitious endeavor, and one fraught with peril and all kinds of delusional tendencies. One of the common misconceptions that I've encountered with younger people wanting to take on the model is this kind of compulsion to start comparing it with other models and to try to create this almost grand unified theory of explaining everything. Good luck with that. So yeah, I mean, I'm all for discovering new ways of interpreting it, new ways of putting it to work. But because of the, let's say, the challenges I've encountered personally over the years, especially in the area of self-delusion, which is, I think, pretty common in any participation of a kind of exploration of occult or off the beaten track or alternative kind of explanations and interpretations of things. If you don't have some way of constantly reality checking yourself, if you don't have some way of constantly reality checking your perceptions so that you can keep coming back to the knowledge, oh yeah, this is a perception. And the way I like to look at perceptions is that I look at perceptions as gambles. I look at all perceptions as gambles. And I have a kind of a gambling spirit about me. I don't, really, I'm not really that fond of certitudes, of being completely sure about anything. I'm not comfortable with it. Actually, that makes me kind of nervous. So I kind of stay away from that. And I like I said earlier on, relate to uncertainty as a creative state, as a place that I feel at home with. I'm actually comfortable with uncertainty, excited by it, and so I relate to almost anything I do, whether it's the eighth circuit brain system, or like currently I'm in pre-production for my next film. I don't know how it's going to go. I don't even know if it's going to happen. And yet that becomes part of the climate of moving forward.
Well, I got to say, you being secure in insecurity, the wisdom of insecurity, as Alan Watts would have said, is perfect timing, because we obviously live in a very VUCA world. There's a lot of changes going on, a lot of systems and institutions are no longer, if they ever did, really serve us. A lot of changes in there, and a lot of people do have a hard time being in that kind of chaotic space. They prefer much more certainty. So the fact that you're much more comfortable in that chaotic space is amazing. And I would encourage people to, not follow your lead as the way you've necessarily lived your life, but you're an exemplar of someone who has led, followed their own tune and has lived in that chaotic space, and happily so. And obviously everyone has their own path to follow, but it's nice to know that people have led the way in their own path and can be models for other people. And let's kind of jump into the next four circuits, which are interesting in and of themselves. But if you could, as you explain what each of the circuits are, how the fifth circuit reflects the first, the sixth, the second, the seventh, the third, the eighth, the fourth. I think that'd be very helpful as well, if you don't mind.
Yeah. So my upper circuit experiences started in high school. And after my first LSD experience, I was 15 years old. I realized two things that seemed wrong about this public education system that pretty much changed the course of my life from that point on. And this dovetails into your question here. One is that I realized that high school, or what I was learning there, overall, nobody was telling me how to think there. I was being taught what to think, but I wasn't taught how to think. And so I was in high school not knowing how to think, and opening up to these higher circuits started stimulating my brain in new areas, and I started learning how to think. The other thing that I learned in high school was that pretty much everything, all of the subjects except for two, had very little, if anything, to do with how I was going to survive in the world outside of high school. And the only courses that looked to me relevant to my post-high school life were typing, typewriter typing, because there were no computers back then, and theater. So I simply decided to get passing grades for everything just to make sure I got out of school. Up until that point, I was almost like a straight A student, but I was just memorizing stuff. I wasn't thinking anymore. And so I graduated and then moved on from there. Of course, typing came in handy because I ended up writing books. And of course, theater became the groundwork and the foundation for my future up to this very point. I'm 68 now, so it's been a long time and a long influence from those early days. Now, I don't take LSD anymore. I stopped taking psychedelics back when I was about 23 or so. And so going back now to the eighth circuit brain, the upper circuits, 5, 6, 7, 8, refer to what I call post-survival experience. The first four refer to survival orientation. How do you get along physically? How do you survive physically? How do you survive emotionally? How do you survive intellectually? How do you enter social survival? How do you get along with people? All of these survival orientations that, for the most part, people get locked into, that becomes their entire life. So those people that are able to kind of cross over into the dimension of post-survival experience can enter at any point. They don't have to go right into 5. They can start with 6, 7, or 8. And oftentimes this can happen, accidentally or by fate. Experiences such as the sudden loss of a loved one, where you lose someone that's near and dear to you, can open up a higher circuit within you where you start perceiving more reality than you knew what to do with. There can be other experiences too, financial windfalls, where all of a sudden you've got more money than you know what to do with, and your survival anxiety has completely disappeared. These kinds of this happens when people win the lottery. So there's all kinds of entry into post-survival experience that are accidental or occurs by fate. So I'm interested in those as well, and addressing situations, because they all the post-survival levels mapped out 5 through 8, they all represent very specific shocks to the system. They're traumatic in their own way. And so the way I define the upper circuits is through these 4 types of shock. Circuit 5 would be the shock of ecstasy. Now, the shock of ecstasy, the way I'm doing that is the shock of any experience where you are completely alleviated of the suffering caused by survival anxiety. So ecstasy here really refers to almost like an innate natural state when people are not in survival anxiety. They're usually feeling pretty good when they're not feeling anxious. And so there's a number of ways of entering that stage. I mean, you can smoke some cannabis and temporarily enter a circuit 5 situation. You can do physical exercise, hit second wind and enter a point of rapture or ecstasy that way. You can enter circuit 5 through experiences of Zen meditation, where you come into an expanded experience of being in present time and coming into more present time interaction with others. Moves into a higher energy state, because you're not just coming from a social point where you're judging them for the group that they're part of, or you're not criticizing them for their mental capacities or whatever. But if you're really being present with other individuals, there's a different experience you'll have, not only of your own state, but also of them, to the extent you can be present with someone. So being present in the here and now is probably the simplest way of entering circuit 5. The 6th circuit is a little more difficult to get into.
Can I ask you a quick question just about
Sure.
circuit 5, if you don't mind?
Yeah.
So you said it's a shock, and I'm wondering if you could explain to the listening audience, if someone accesses circuit 5 through grace or a certain spiritual practice, or however it happens to be, does it clean up the circuit 1 issues, or can it clean up circuit 1 issues, or do you have to have those cleaned up first before you can access circuit 5?
Oh, no, not at all. See, what happens, the way I'm looking at the lower circuits in relation to the upper circuits is in a very particular way. The lower circuits, to me, act or can act as anchors to stabilize and integrate the shocks of the upper circuits. Every pothead knows what it's like to get too high, and meaning you get so high that I had an agreement from the dog there. The dog agrees. Are we still on the air? That's wild. That was a circuit 2 territorial bark from the dog there. So anyway, sometimes, you can get too high in circuit 5, whether it's, through meditation, through smoking pot, or whatever it is, and your circuit one experience of survival on the planet becomes dispersed, and you start forgetting to pay the rent, or you lose your job because you missed the schedule of being there on time and you got fired, or so there are consequences to over-amping or over-emphasizing any of the upper circuits, and it has to do with uprooting or destabilizing the lower circuit that's connected to that particular upper circuit. And as you mentioned earlier, circuit 1 is the one I think is most directly connected to 5, and circuit 2 to 6, circuit 3 to 7, and circuit 4 to 8. And so each of the upper 4 also, not only are they representing experience of post-survival, but they also refer to certain types of shock and also experiences of destabilizing our survival orientation in 4 different ways, with the lower 4 circuits. So no, just because you can get high doesn't mean it cleans up the first circuit, or that you can't get high until you have first circuit altogether. There's all kinds of demonstrations of a lot of people getting high and they don't have their survival trip together.
Yeah, got it. No, that's very clear. Thank you. All right, so on to circuit 6, the neuropsychic trance.
Yeah, circuit 6 is very tricky because to approach it and engage it consciously, I think there's got to be some capacity to, how can I put this, to enter a way of paying attention where you're not immediately assigning labels and meaning to what you're perceiving, and instead are participating purely in an action of inner seeing, of just simply seeing without labeling or projecting meaning onto it. And so I've come to understand this process as 2 different types of attention, what I call the first attention and the second attention. The first attention, I'm calling the first attention because I'm thinking it's in predominant use and definition of most people. And I use that phrase, most people, in a precarious way, as that attention that's basically linked to language and the thinking machine and the automatic assignment of labels and meaning to things. Meaning, it's the attention that I think is most commonly defined and experienced as attention. I'm paying attention to something, but I'm also labeling it. I'm also assigning meaning to it. So there's more than just attention going on. Second attention would be that awareness linked to presence, to phenomena or energy, without the automatic reflex of assigning labels to it or meaning to it. It is simply seeing. And so there's a mystery to that. You're not knowing what you're seeing, and yet you're seeing at the same time. And so this is a center that sometimes results in a kind of clairvoyance, which is a French word for clear seeing. Clairvoyance, of course, of being able to perceive energy fields, perceiving auras around people, sometimes seeing events occurring beyond time and space, meaning into the future a little bit, or seeing something like remote viewing experiences that happen in various, PSI experiments in Russia or the United States, the CIA, et cetera, remote viewing experiments. These are all sixth center activation experiments. And I think that's where I want to leave this. What I want to say about Circuit 6 is this capacity for seeing without assigning labels or meaning to what you're seeing.
Let me just ask you to add one more thing to that too, because with Circuit 5, you mentioned that the negative consequences of it could be that it shocks the first circuit, and you can't do activities of daily life as you kind of walk through that a little bit. Can you walk through some of the kind of quote negative consequences of circuit 6?
Yeah. See, what happens oftentimes in, when you're participating in that interaction of seeing without assigning labels or meanings, is that you enter also a kind of consciousness that that Robert Anton Wilson referred to as reality selection.
Mm-hmm.
And the bias of reality selection is one of relativism, of being able to see all these different options, ways of seeing things as equal in value. So you get to see, it's a little bit like fence sitting. You see the good and bad of everything. You see the Democrats and the Republican as equal in value, everything being equal in value. And this relativistic outlook is often exalted and favored amongst many young people using the system or using psychoactive drugs, and it becomes kind of a cool or assumed to be cool position to take, to think relativistically. But what happens there in the second circuit is that the sense of one's own sense of territoriality is dismissed. And basically what happens, that person will tend to then have what's called, let's say, boundary issues, where they don't believe in personal boundaries anymore, or they don't know where they stand anymore because everything is of equal value. So why stand for anything? Mm-hmm. And so it's a little bit like, well, if you don't know where you're standing, you may just fall for anything. It becomes its own kind of naivete in the political area. And what I mean by political area, I'm not just talking about right and left or Republican, Democratic, but I'm talking about also personal politics in terms of, where you're at with your own power and your own influence. Well, that's going to come from having a solid sense of where you stand, your position, where you're coming from, and believing in it. And with the relativistic outlook, it's very tough to believe in anything. In fact, there's almost like a dogma of don't believe in anything. It becomes its own belief.
Thank you. That's very helpful. You mentioned for Circuit 5, cannabis, meditation, other such practices can turn it on. What practices, besides grace, can turn on Circuit 6?
Well, like I said, learning to pay attention, without assigning labels or meanings, it's its own kind of practice. Mm-hmm. I don't, let's say, condone psychoactive drugs anymore because I don't take them. So I don't condone the thing that I don't do. But it can be helpful for others, and it can be an effective activation for sure. Psilocybin, mescaline, LSD, etc. And then, there's just different shocks that come to us, and the shock of Circuit 6, I think I would describe as a shock of uncertainty, and especially the experience of escalating uncertainty, where you come into a more and more honest sensibility of, I don't know what the fuck is happening. I don't know where I'm going. I don't know who I am. These kinds of open-ended experiences of unknowns can blast open Circuit 6 as well. And this can happen naturally enough, if someone is like between jobs or between relationships or between, let's say, been evicted from their apartment, they're between homes, they're in between personalities. Anytime when you're in a marginal state where the experience of uncertainty is escalating on a daily basis, where you either learn to become more at home in unknowns, or you just start acting like a nervous monkey because you don't know how to manage your anxiety.
All right. Well, very helpful. Thank you. So we've gone through Circuit 5 and Circuit 6. Circuit 7, the gene mytho-poetic trance, which is also, as you say, is related to Circuit 3. Can you speak a little bit about that one?
Yeah. Yeah, Circuit 7, wow. Um, so whereas the Circuit 6 was more, let's say, linked to the central nervous system and the human brain, and the nervous system and the human brain, in a sense, becoming aware of itself, the self-aware nervous system, so that the individual learns to navigate through the world as a nervous system, not just as a physical body. So Circuit 7 it runs much deeper than that, because we're really talking about the creator of the nervous system, which is the DNA, the intelligence in the DNA. And so these experiences have come to me through shocks of indivisibility, where I come into an undeniable sense of unity with all living things, a little bit like how the DNA acts as a language connecting all living things. So then when you kind of synchronize with the genetic or DNA intelligence, you're also synchronized with the experience of being part of all living things. There's no more separation, in a sense, between me and everything else. I am part of life as I know it moving through me. And so there's the beginning of a kind of mysticism here. And it's a mysticism that is intimately linked with, I think, the direct personal experience of the planet, of this earth that we're on, as a vastly intelligent and oftentimes compassionate entity that has incarnated as the planet. So no longer, is this view of the earth as this, rock spinning through space. It now becomes Gaia, and that there's a living intelligence that has embodied as this planet. And we are part of that. We are expressions of that. We are conduits of the planet. We are no longer just individual egos, but we are also these conduits interacting with other conduits of planet Earth. And so it's through these kinds of shocks of indivisibility, I've come to this sense that maybe, just maybe, the planet is calling the shots. That no matter what's going on surface-wise, we may think, oh, the humans are responsible for this, or this group is responsible for that. And yet there may be deeper planetary pulses and energies occurring in certain bioregions on the planet that that are expressing the planet's own rhythms and its own processes of transformation that directly impact human politics, that directly impact human experience, that directly impact human outcomes and fates, that the planet may be calling the shots.
Now, might the microbiome be one example among many of the Earth speaking to individual consciousness through the microbiome to affect behavior?
Yeah, that could be another way of putting it. There's a particular ritual that I introduce in my course for people to get just a taste of what this might be, and it's called bump consciousness. And it's basically going out into nature somewhere and just sitting alone and emptying your mind as much as you can and cultivating a kind of internal receptivity, and to begin pulling up the energy of the earth below up into your body, and then through breathing, circulating this earth energy throughout your body until you reach a point of density. And this density moves into this experience of simply being a bump on the planet. So I call this bump consciousness.
And I think it's really important for me to point out to the listening audience that your whole book is not just, here's a really interesting theory, but you lay out tons of different practices to access these different states or intelligences which I think is so important, and I want to highlight that. Before we move on to Circuit 8, could you say how Circuit 7 connects to Circuit 3? Circuit 3 was the concepts, semantic trance, mental model, mental self,
Oh,
sense.
sure. Well, Circuit 3, representing intellectual intelligence. And intellect, by its very nature, requires duality. It requires the capacity for association and comparative and reductive thinking. This is part of how we solve our survival problems, how we make money, and so forth, how we can count and get the right amount when we count. So experiences of Circuit 7 indivisibility, it's a shock unity. That kind of profound sense of unity it acts as a shock to Circuit 3 intellect, because in all honesty, when intellect is faced with the experience of that kind of unity, it freezes up. It kind of gets stunned. There's no duality to interact with. You can't figure it out. There's nowhere to move with that. So what can happen, and this is kind of a simplistic way of saying it, is that either, the intellect goes mad or it becomes enlightened. And it goes mad by, constantly trying to figure something out that is not meant to be figured out but experienced, or it bows down. It becomes subservient to the higher intelligence that is behind the shock, behind the invisibility, and learns to adjust the thinking process to serve a more intuitive and a more experience-based approach to gaining knowledge. So knowledge is no longer derived from theory, but is really distilled from a more direct experience. So it's really a kind of a transition from intellect towards intuition, and more specifically, learning how to train intellect to serve intuition, so it doesn't dominate and tyrannize the intuitive function. And this interaction between the third and the seventh is perhaps maybe my most favorite interaction, because I write screenplays for visionary films. Now, the visions that come to me for the visionary films are not Third Circuit experiences. They come from Seventh Circuit interactions with what I would call the realm of the muses. These are autonomous archetypes that I interact with. And as crazy making, or as crazy as that may sound, it's a reality to my experience. Subjectively, it's real to me. So I have to find ways to write the screenplay that somehow can serve the vision, the initial impressions, in such a way that doesn't, dominate it with overthinking or over-explanation or over-describing, but somehow, because my aim as an artist is to provide experiences for the audience. I'm not there to school them. I'm not there to educate them. I'm there to provide experience. And so my films end up being experiences through stories, through characters, that is really part of my own personal interaction between Third Circuit and Circuit 7.
Before we get into Circuit 8, the quantum dream body, and since you mentioned your films, how do they come to you?
How did what come to you?
Like, do you have a practice, like, I want to create a new film, you sit down and do something? Or does it come to you other ways? Like, how do the ideas around a film emerge inside of your mind?
I don't think they really emerge inside of my mind. I've kind of trained my mind to become more of kind of a radar, more of a receptive vessel, so to speak. And so I basically I'm patient and stay receptive. And so I get a call, is the way probably the most direct way I put it. I feel called, or I hear a call, and I follow the call. And I don't know where it's going. I don't know where I'm going, but it doesn't matter, because, again, uncertainty being, for me, a creative state. And so each of my films have come about through following a call, and sometimes that call has involved the need for me to work out certain traumas, certain shocks to my own system that I have not been able to work out in any other way than somehow artistically, symbolically. And so that's kind of been my way of transforming tragic into magic, transforming very difficult emotions or scenarios that I've had to endure in my life into creative directions.
Nice. Well, and that kind of fits nicely with what you're talking about, Robert Anton Wilson, and how he was able to take, the tragic loss of his daughter and turns it from tragic to magic. So you
Yeah.
obviously you're embodying that a way of being in the world.
Well, he and I certainly had that in common. We met in 1979, and I was in his physical company for almost 5 years, on and off. And then we had correspondence for another 10 years. When I was 40, I suffered the sudden loss of my own daughter. And that launched me into a 20 plus year era of filmmaking, meaning that particular shock of impermanence, which is a circuit 8 shock, the shock of impermanence, nothing lasts, opened up a door to perceiving more reality than I knew what to do with, basically. Up until that point, I was working, in the medium of theater, and I was more accustomed to working out my problems and issues through theatrical means. But there's something that happened there in the loss of my daughter that it was too great, too unfathomable, too all-encompassing. And I knew I needed another medium. I knew I needed something that was more complex and multi-layered. And so I bought a video camera and just started pointing at this and that. And I started practicing making little short pieces. And I discovered, okay, maybe this is a direction that I can start, channeling, some of these visions through. But also, it's a circuit 4 process. Filmmaking is completely teamwork oriented. It's not like me making films. I'm always making with a group. Mm-hmm. And so probably 90% of my circuit 4 experiences, my social experiences, have been through the teamwork processes of creating works for theater and film. Very little of my social experiences are like, hanging out or going to a bar or a pub or something like that and just hanging out with people. I just don't hang out. It's always been more in conjunction to these following these visions, and by the grace of those who agree to get on the journey with me, working with others.
Well, let me just acknowledge your loss of your daughter, and I'm sorry for that. And thank you for bringing it up in the context of, tragic to magic and what it kind of led you to do in terms of your work. You mentioned Circuit 4, moralistic social trance. Can you contextualize out the last of the 4 post-survival circuits, which is Circuit 8, quantum dream body?
Yeah. I was awakened to Circuit 8 experience early on at the age of 23 after a very exhausting rehearsal of a mime play, a complete full-length mime play that I was directing. And it was a kind of exhaustion I hadn't known before, and what it led to was a genuine out-of-body experience that pretty much changed the course of my life from then on, because it has haunted me ever since in a number of different ways. Probably the least of which wasn't this inability to ever identify myself as a physical body. That through the out-of-body experience, I had a very substantial identification with a double, with an energetic body that was independent of my physical body. And it wasn't a dream, because in dreams, when we have dreams. The dream body sort of is an out-of-body experience. When people have dreams, it's a little bit like an out-of-body experience.
Mm-hmm.
But this was not a dream. This was actually something different. And I bring this up because I attribute that experience to the necessity to continue working with groups, and that's the social circuit 4 process of helping me integrate and anchor that out-of-body experience. And that's happened ever since, because the thing is, before that experience, I was actually developing more as a solo performer. I wasn't really working with groups as much. I was working with groups sort of as a side project, but more like pushing and promoting myself as a solo performer. But after the out-of-body experience, that almost completely went to the wayside, and I realized that I needed to somehow, and I at that point, I had not known anything about the 8th circuit brain, so I was not like planning, oh, I need now to get social because of my 8th circuit experience. No, I didn't have a clue. It was just more of an instinct. And so since then, pretty much everything that I've done, with the exception of writing books, which is a solitary experience. However, writing books also connects me to many people. So, I have interactions with many people who read my books. So it's in its weird kind of way that's social, but not really, because it's more online, more virtual, which I don't count. I don't believe in quote unquote social media. I don't see that as a social experience. So at this point, this little moment here, I think I forgot your question.
That's fine. I was just asking because you're talking about Circuit 4, the moralistic social trance, and I just asked you to kind of use that as a way in to start talking about Circuit 8, the quantum dream body trance. You talked about conscious leaves the physical body, kind of functioning non-locally and kind of a dream time. Is that very similar to the Aboriginal dream time?
Yeah, it is. It is. In fact, in the mid-'80s, I was interviewing and working for a newspaper in Boulder, Colorado, and I was assigned to interview this Aborigine Koori elder that was touring through Boulder from Australia. And that particular meeting ended up as almost a kind of initiatic encounter that was completely unexpected, because I came out of that in a sense almost like a changed person, because of not so much what he said, but the spiritual connection that I unexpectedly experienced with him, and what he had presented about his work with the dream time inspired in me the creation of a dream time ritual in the paratheater work that I've been developing since 1977, and that I've also made a documentary video called Dream Body, Earth Body, which is on YouTube. People can find it. Go Dream Body / Earth Body. That approaches the experience of dreaming in a very particular way, meaning that it involves a unique kind of dream recall for movements remembered from dreams. So it's not about remembering colors or faces or characters, but specific movements. And it doesn't have to be movements done by a person. It can be a movement of a tree branch blown by the wind, or it could be the movement of an animal crossing the floor. So the aim of the dream body ritual, the dream time ritual, is to remember 3 separate movements. It can be from the same dream, or it can be from any dream, as long as you can replicate the movement upon awakening. And the process of building that ritual is really a kind of ritual choreography of using those 3 movements by connecting them together to create a movement cycle that you participate in, where the three movements become one fluid, larger movement of three different phases. And in participating in the execution of that movement cycle, something uncommon occurs, and that is the particular memories, emotions, images, and power of the dreaming starts coming through, almost as if the movements themselves were talismans from the dream dimensions, because these are not movements that we made up with our minds. We simply remembered them from the dreams we experienced. Mm-hmm. And so the aim of the dream body movement is for those people who might be interested in coming into a more direct experience of the power of dreaming while fully awake and physically active. So it's not like a sit-down meditation, or it's not like, it's not passive, it's active. And so this becomes its own kind of circuit 8 experience, but it's in the body. It's so kind of strange. It starts with the dream, but then it starts moving into the body at that point. So in a way, it's a kind of connection between circuit 8 and circuit 1 as well, because of the physical connection and the kinetic properties of the ritual.
And I know at the very beginning of this conversation, you said you're not a big fan of meta theories or meta models, trying to explain everything. Understandably so. However, what's fascinating listening to you talk about the different, especially the post-4 survival circuits, is that there are so many transpersonal models and maps, spiritual systems that map onto this really well.
Yeah.
Which is really fascinating.
Well, speaking of this 8th circuit and its connection to the 4th circuit, one really kind of great example is especially Buddhism, but in particular Tibetan Buddhism, where a big part of the meditation, the actual experience, is to enter intimacy with void, to enter into direct knowledge or gnosis of nothingness, or this void space, towards, in a sense, becoming indivisible with the void. So you become as an expression of the void. You become an expression of that mystery. And at the very same time, Buddhism is a very social, community-based religion. And I know a lot of Buddhists wouldn't even call it a religion, because it's very different from Muslim or Christianity or Judaism, but it is its own kind of religion, because it has this esoteric practice of sitting, entering intimacy with the void, and then coming into community life. It's a very socially based religion. Unlike Taoism, Taoism is more anarchistic, more in terms of kind of the kind of individuals that are most committed to Taoism tend to be more anarchistic in their temperament and to their spirit. It's not so much a social religion as Buddhism is. But Buddhism is, I think, very intelligent. Buddhism, I think, is a very intelligent religion in that it has a great knowledge of how that dynamic encounter with the void really needs to be anchored into community life.
Right. And another thing I just want to point out, which is also fascinating about the 8th circuit brain model, is you can look at an individual, which we've just really been talking through, like how does an individual go through these different circuits, and when the circuits are shocked from higher circuits, what's that mean? But you can also look at culture or cultures historically through this framework as well, and just see what circuits are more prevalent, maybe is a way of saying it, or activated than others, and what spiritual systems within those cultures are active in terms of which circuits are being morely focused on than others. So it can be a kind of a way of looking at cultures and history, societies, not just individuals. Would that be a correct way of kind of understanding it as well?
I wouldn't know. It's just simply not in my field of interest.
Okay. Sounds good. Before we talk about, how people can find your work, your various books, your films, one thing I mentioned earlier on is that Timothy Leary popularized the model, but I want you, if you wouldn't mind, just like 30 seconds into where it came from originally, that he picked it up and ran with it. So I think that history is interesting as you continue on the process.
Um, the origin of the model, I think, is genuinely mysterious.
Yeah.
Timothy Leary's book, What Does Woman Want? There's a preface of the book that explains probably the closest description of where and how he discovered the system through this individual that Leary refers to as Professor Adams, and I have no idea if that's his actual name. And supposedly he was a Hindu scholar at Rutgers University, and that he was visiting Timothy Leary in the mid-60s at the Millbrook estate, where Timothy Leary was kind of camped out with a bunch of his friends and students, and in those walks, supposedly Leary had absorbed what might be called an oral transmission of the more esoteric Hindu chakra system. And I say esoteric Hindu chakra system to differentiate it from the many books in the New Age community that are, describing the Hindu chakra system. So this is a slightly off the beaten path of the more populist chakra system. And that Leary at the time, back in his Harvard days, he was teaching in Harvard. His nickname was Theory Leary, simply because his peers knew him as this individual who's constantly producing theory after theory after theory. So Leary was a theorist chiefly, and his process of taking that esoteric system and moving it into a more contemporary context by referring to at that point was only 7 levels. He didn't add the 8th level for another few years, calling them circuits, because at that point he realized that the future was in computers and electronics, and so he wanted to bring his theories into a more contemporary cutting edge, and so the circuits were, they were named like that. And this is also, I think, a very good reason to understand the difference between the human chakra system and the 8th circuit brain system. There are certain correlations, but the main difference is that the chakra systems are based in the biological endocrine glandular system. It's a biological system based in life processes. And the 8th circuit brain system is a symbolic system representing 8 different functions of intelligence to be discovered. And the thing I didn't mention that Leary introduced, I think one of his primary contributions, was this notion that intelligence could be increased through each of the 8 circuits by our capacity to mimic the most basic unit of biological intelligence, which is the neuron, and the neuron's capacity to absorb, integrate, or store and transmit information and or energy. So he had this idea that if you were able to absorb, integrate, and transmit the experience of each of the 8 circuits, you can move through them more effectively that way. And I thought that was a really brilliant contribution.
Great. Thank you. I really appreciate that, because it's nice for the listening audience to kind of know the history of where this model came from. So for folks who are interested in learning more about the 8 circuit brain, Navigational Strategies for the Energetic Body, your book, as well as any of your movies and other projects, where can they find more about you?
Verticalpool.com.
And that's all your books and all your movies as well?
Yeah, my movies are listed on there. There's a link. The movies that I have made over the last 25 years are now all presented online for free viewing. I don't make money from my movies, nor do I make money from my books. They go to other sources, but you can find pretty much, I would say, probably more about me than in my work than you want to know, at verticalpool.com. And you'll also find a link there to my paratheatrical research.
Fantastic. Well, I definitely appreciate your time. This is very exciting for me because, as I mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, this is a model that I first discovered in the late 90s. And it's very exciting to have this conversation with you to kind of unpack it. And let me encourage our listening audience to check out your books, check out your movies, and check you out. And I appreciate your time.
Thanks for letting me check you out.
Great to talk to you. Take care.
Bye.